The basketball world just witnessed something absolutely wild. Fred VanVleet, the guy who couldn't even get drafted 8 years ago, just became the most powerful player in the entire NBA, not through scoring titles or MVP awards, but through something far more significant. He's now the president of the National Basketball Players Association, controlling the fate of every single player in the league. But here's the thing that'll blow your mind: this wasn't supposed to happen. VanVleet was supposed to be forgotten, washed out, another casualty of the brutal NBA system. Instead, he just pulled off one of the most incredible power grabs in sports history. And when you dig into how this all went down, the story gets even more insane. The story starts in 2016, and it's painful to watch. Picture this: hundreds of college basketball players enter the NBA draft, dreaming of their names being called. Fred VanVleet sits at home in Rockford, Illinois, watching every single pick go by. First round? Nothing. Second round? Still nothing. 60 picks later, he's officially undrafted. The NBA basically told him he wasn't good enough to even deserve a chance. Most guys would have given up right there, maybe headed overseas or found a regular job. But VanVleet, he had something different burning inside him. The Toronto Raptors threw him a bone with a summer league contract, probably expecting him to fade away quietly. What happened next shocked everyone, including the Raptors themselves. But let's back up for a second and talk about what led to this moment. VanVleet wasn't some random scrub who got lucky. At Wichita State, he was a floor general who helped lead the Shockers to the Final Four in 2013. He was putting up serious numbers, averaging over 12 points and 5 assists per game in his senior year. But scouts looked at his 6-foot frame and decided he was too small, too slow, not athletic enough for the NBA. They completely missed what made him special: his basketball IQ, his leadership, and his absolute refusal to accept limitations. The draft night snub wasn't just a rejection, it was fuel for what was about to become one of the most incredible revenge stories in sports. Those first few years in Toronto were brutal beyond what most people realize. VanVleet was averaging less than 3 points per game as a rookie, playing garbage time minutes while real players got the spotlight. Fans didn't even know his name. He was basically invisible, just another body filling out the roster. The G League assignments came frequently, and each one felt like a reminder that he didn't belong. But behind the scenes, something incredible was happening. VanVleet was studying the game like his life depended on it, learning from veterans like Kyle Lowry and DeMar DeRozan, and slowly proving he belonged. He wasn't just working on his shot or his handles, he was learning how to think the game at an elite level. The breakthrough didn't happen overnight. In his second season, VanVleet started getting more meaningful minutes, and people began to notice something different. He wasn't just surviving anymore, he was making plays. His assist numbers jumped, his shooting improved, and most importantly, he was earning the trust of his teammates. By his third season, the transformation was undeniable. He wasn't just surviving anymore, he was thriving. Coach Dwayne Casey started giving him crucial minutes, and VanVleet was delivering in ways that made scouts look foolish for passing on him. And then 2019 happened, the year that changed everything. The Toronto Raptors were facing the Golden State Warriors in the NBA Finals, and everyone expected the Warriors to dominate. This was the dynasty team with Stephen Curry, Klay Thompson, and Kevin Durant. The Raptors were supposed to be happy just to be there. But VanVleet had other plans. In the most crucial moments of the biggest games, this undrafted nobody started hitting shots that legendary players miss. Game 4 was the turning point. VanVleet scored 14 points in the fourth quarter alone, draining three-pointers that seemed impossible. He averaged over 14 points in the finals, including a performance in Game 6 that basically sealed Toronto's first championship. Suddenly, the guy who couldn't get drafted was holding up the Larry O'Brien trophy. But that was just the beginning of his incredible rise. The championship changed everything for VanVleet, but not in the way you might expect. Instead of getting a big head or relaxing, he became even more focused. He knew that one championship run doesn't define a career, especially for an undrafted player. The doubters were still there, whispering that he was just a role player who got hot at the right time. So VanVleet did what he always does. He went back to work. The 2019-20 season was when he really announced himself as a star. He averaged 17.6 points, 6.6 assists, and 3.8 rebounds while shooting nearly 40% from three-point range. These weren't fluke numbers. This was sustained excellence. 3 years later, VanVleet did something that seemed impossible. He became the first undrafted player since Ben Wallace in 2006 to make the NBA All-Star team. Think about that for a second. In 16 years, Not a single undrafted player had earned that honor. The league had basically written off undrafted guys as role players at best. VanVleet shattered that ceiling completely. He was averaging over 20 points per game, leading the Raptors and proving that draft position means absolutely nothing if you have the right mindset. The All-Star selection wasn't just personal validation, it was a statement to every undrafted player that the impossible was possible. But here's where the story gets even more interesting. VanVleet's rise wasn't just about basketball skills, he was developing into a leader, someone who understood the business side of the game. He was active in the Players Association, speaking up about issues that mattered to players at all levels. While superstars worried about their brand deals and max contracts, VanVleet was thinking about the guys fighting for minimum wage contracts, the two-way players, the ones who reminded him of his own journey. This perspective was about to make him incredibly valuable in ways nobody anticipated. When VanVleet signed with the Houston Rockets in 2023, the numbers were staggering. A 3-year, $130 million deal that made him the highest-paid undrafted player in NBA history. But here's what most people missed. This wasn't just about money. VanVleet was positioning himself as a leader, someone who could bridge the gap between superstars and role players. The Rockets weren't just buying a point guard, they were investing in a future leader. General manager Rafael Stone understood that VanVleet brought something rare, credibility with players at every level of the league, and that investment just paid off in ways nobody saw coming. The move to Houston wasn't without controversy. Raptors fans felt betrayed, and some questioned whether VanVleet was chasing money over loyalty. But what they didn't understand was that VanVleet was making a calculated move. Houston was rebuilding, which meant he'd have more responsibility and a bigger platform. He was also entering a Western Conference that would test him against elite competition every night. Most importantly, he was joining a franchise that valued his leadership qualities as much as his basketball skills. The Rockets gave him a voice in personnel decisions and treated him as more than just a player. His first season in Houston proved the move was brilliant. VanVleet averaged 15.5 points and 8.1 assists while mentoring young players like Alperen Sengun and Jalen Green. But more importantly, he was building relationships across the league. Players noticed how he carried himself, how he treated teammates, and how he spoke about the game. When trade rumors swirled around other players, VanVleet was often the one they called for advice. He was becoming a player's advocate without even trying. Fast forward to this week, and the NBA landscape just shifted completely. During the annual summer meeting of the Board of Player Representatives, Fred VanVleet was elected as the new president of the NBPA, replacing CJ McCollum, who had held the position for 4 years. This isn't just some honorary title. The NBPA president essentially controls every major decision affecting NBA players. We're talking about salary caps, playoff formats, schedule changes, and massive negotiations with team owners. VanVleet now has more influence over the league than most franchise owners, and the timing couldn't be more critical. The election itself was fascinating. VanVleet ran on a platform of unity and representation for all players, not just superstars. He talked about his journey from undrafted to all-star, emphasizing that he understood the struggles of players at every level. His message resonated with role players who felt ignored by previous leadership, while superstars respected his championship pedigree and business acumen. The vote wasn't even close. VanVleet won decisively, earning endorsements from players across different generations and skill levels. The NBA is heading into some of the most important negotiations in decades. The current collective bargaining agreement expires soon, and there are massive issues on the table. Player salaries, revenue sharing, playoff expansion, and even the possibility of an NBA expansion to new cities. VanVleet will be sitting across from billionaire owners, fighting for every dollar and every right that players deserve. But here's what makes this fascinating. He's not your typical union president. Most NBPA leaders have been established superstars or veteran players with obvious credentials. VanVleet brings something different, the perspective of someone who had to fight for every opportunity. The owners are probably thinking they can push around this guy who wasn't even drafted. They're about to learn that underestimating Fred VanVleet is the biggest mistake they could make. He's already proven that conventional wisdom means nothing. He went from undrafted to champion, from minimum wage to $130 million, from unknown to union president. His negotiating style is expected to be methodical and relentless, much like his playing career. He doesn't back down from challenges, and he has the respect of players who know he's been where they are. One of the biggest challenges VanVleet will face is the growing divide between superstars and role players. Max contract players have different concerns than guys fighting for roster spots. VanVleet's unique position as someone who's experienced both sides gives him credibility that few others possess. He knows what it's like to worry about getting cut, but he also understands the pressures of being a franchise player. This perspective could be exactly what the union needs during these crucial negotiations. The international expansion of the NBA is another major issue on VanVleet's plate. With talks of games in Europe, Asia, and other markets, player safety and compensation become crucial concerns. VanVleet's championship experience in Toronto, an international market, gives him insights into what players face when the league expands globally. He's expected to push for better travel conditions, adequate rest between games, and fair compensation for the additional revenue that international expansion brings. What happens next could reshape the entire NBA. VanVleet has already proven that conventional wisdom means nothing. He went from undrafted to champion, from minimum wage to $130 million, from unknown to union president. Now he's got 4 years to prove that an undrafted player can outmaneuver some of the smartest business minds in sports. The owners probably think they can push around this guy who wasn't even drafted. They're about to learn that underestimating Fred VanVleet is the biggest mistake they could make. The kid who couldn't get picked 60 times in 2016 is now the most powerful player in basketball. His story isn't just about basketball anymore. It's about proving that where you start doesn't determine where you finish. Every undrafted player, every bench warmer, every guy fighting for a roster spot now has someone in the highest office who understands their struggle. And something tells me he's just getting started. The next 4 years of NBA labor relations are going to be absolutely wild. And Fred VanVleet is holding all the cards.